with that music, it is time for the Soulful Psalms segment of Beacon of Truth. The Soulful Psalms is where we take one of the Psalms from the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, from the Jewish hymnal, if you will. That's also part of our liturgical worship as Catholics, because we hear the Psalms in each and every holy sacrifice of the Mass. And the great thing about the Soulful Psalms is that its own podcast. That's right. You can go to the EWTN website and go to Podcast Central, or, as I do, listen on the EWTN app, which has all kinds of amazing content there. Or you can even download and listen on your favorite podcast platform, like SoundCloud and iTunes and Spotify, and listen to the Soulful Psalms as well as Beacon of Truth each and every day. And I'm using the Revised Grail Psalm, so it doesn't matter if you're following along, if you have your New American Bible or Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition, or even the second edition of that, Dewey Reams, whatever one you're using, that's fine. But the version that I'm using is the Revised Grail Psalms that were updated from the Psalms, the original Grail that was released in the 1970s, and has been approved for use by the bishops at Mass, and was compiled by the Benedictine monks of Conception Abbey. Well, for the past few weeks, we've been walking through Psalm 78. So Psalm 78 is a psalm that where Asaph, one of the superintendents of the musical guild of the Jewish temple, who wrote a number of the psalms and also put music to them as well, he's walking us through salvation history. Now, this psalm is typically only prayed in the liturgy of the hours, the divine office, if you're on the 4-week cycle, during Advent and Lent. And so it's a very long psalm. And so we've been going through. So what we're at right now is we're going through the plagues. So Asaph now is reminding us of the plagues. Now remember, the plagues happened because you think, well, why? And I mentioned this the other day. Why didn't God just start with the Passover and the slaughter of the first slaughter of the firstborn of every man and animal? Just start with that, and they would have been released a lot sooner. But God wanted to show his power and authority over the gods of Egypt. So each of these plagues, in their own way, was showing God's power and authority over one of the gods. So we talked about the first plague, the Nile turning into blood, was showing God's authority and dominion over Hapi, which was the river god of the Egyptians. And then we had the plague with the frogs, which was showing domination over Heket, which is the frog goddess of the Egyptians. And so we continue through the narrative here from Asaph. He talked about the insects, the frogs. He starting at verse 46, he gave their crops to insects, the fruit of their labor to locusts. And so we see that in Exodus chapter 8, verses 16 to 19. And then the flies also in Exodus chapter 8, verses 20 to 32. And so we see, again, the Lord exercising authority over nature, including the gods of the Egyptians themselves. And then he continues in verse 47. He destroyed their vines with hail, their sycamore trees with frost. He gave up their cattle to hail, their herds to darts of lightning. And so we see that's the fifth plague in the cattle. Again, it mentions specifically the cattle here, which is against Apis, which is the bull god, and also Ares, which is the sheep god of the Egyptians. So again, God is going through with each of these plagues, exercising dominion and authority over nature, of course, over the animals, but to show that he is the God of nature, not these gods like have a god for the river, a god for... No, there's only one God. There's only one God, and he's showing that his power and authority is greater than the other gods of the culture. Then he said, he unleashed on them the heat of his anger, fury, rage, havoc, a troop of destroying angels. I love how vivid Asaph gets here. What he talks about, again, God is a God of love, right? But we often apply human, again, I've said this before, human attributes, human feelings, human emotions, human reactions to God. in order to relate to him better as human beings. So we can see when these plagues were happening, you can imagine the Israelites seeing these plagues that are happening and saying, look what God is doing. God is showing his fury and his rage and his havoc. And well, God's not doing that, of course. I mean, again, applying human feelings, human emotions, human reactions to God, which I think makes God more relatable. Or again, trying to explain what they're seeing, these phenomena that are happening, and they're explaining it as, look, God is a God of justice, and he's exercising justice. He's exercising his divine authority over the injustice that has been done to his chosen people. All right. So that's what's going on here. And I love he talks about a troop of destroying angels, which to me is reminiscent of the book of Revelation, right? When the angels on the horses were sent, and one was over the sea and one was over the land, the troop of destroying angels. And, so we again, using that vivid language that God is using angels also for his will, right? Because angels are, of course, created with infused knowledge. Everything that they are to know, they know at the moment of their creation. They can make a decision, yes or no, for God. And angels are there to serve God at different levels. Of course, we know there's 9 levels of angels. See if I remember. There's angels and archangels, cherubim and seraphim, thrones, dominions, principalities, powers, and virtues are the 9 levels of angels. And they're all there, serve God differently in different ways. Cherubim and seraphim serve God, are the ones that serve closest to God, closest to the altar of God, closest to his presence. And of course, we have the archangels and the other group of angels who are called by God to serve in different ways. All right. And then we continue in verse 50. He leveled a path for his anger. He did not spare their lives from death. And so we see this, this was called an enjambment, which is kind of a parallelism where one idea or one thought continues in the different, what's called kola, or the different verses of the Psalms, but it's expressed in a different way. So what Asaph is doing here, he's talking about God releasing his anger, and then he continues that theme, but he kind of like expands on it, right? And he shows a different aspect of that same theme of what God is doing. Leveled a path for his anger. He did not spare their lives from death, but gave their livestock to the plague. Again, continuing this theme about the cattle and the livestock from Exodus chapter 8, Exodus chapter 9, verses 1 through about 26, right around there. Right? And then he brought forth his people like sheep. Like a flock, he led them in the desert. He doesn't. So, what Asaph doesn't do, he doesn't go through all the plagues, right? I think he just did enough of the plagues down through the 5th plague of the 9 different plagues, or the 10 plagues to make a point. The 10th plague, of course, is the firstborn. So the ones that he didn't cover were the 6th plague, which were the boils. Exodus chapter 9, 8 to 13. The hail. Well, he actually does mention the hail here. Exodus 9, 13, 35. The locusts, Exodus 10, 1 to 20. The darkness, right, which shows power and authority over Ra, which was the sun god, Exodus 10, 21 to 29. And then the purpose, he wants to show he will execute judgment over all the gods of Egypt once again. All right. Then he says he led them into the desert. He struck the first. Now we get to the last plague in verse 51. He struck the firstborn of Egypt, the first vigor of youth from the dwellings of Ham. All right. And so he talks about that. It goes to that very last plague, which is, of course, the plague that finally convinced Pharaoh to allow the Israelite people to be let go and led them and he brought them into the desert. And so we'll pick up there at verse 52, where he's starting to lead them into the desert and what God has done for them once he released them from from Pharaoh's slavery.
For more on the Psalms with Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers, check out Beacon of Truth weekdays at 4 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio and streaming everywhere you listen to podcasts.